There is a tsunami warning for parts of California and Oregon after a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck offshore.
Late at night, the quiet in Northern California was suddenly interrupted as the ground beneath residents' feet began to tremble. At first, it was gentle with a small shake that didn't feel like much. But before they knew it, the shaking grew stronger.
Dad, there's an earthquake happening. Look at the pool.
We're starting to get a clearer picture of all the damage. The quake struck off the coast of Humboldt County about 10:45 this morning.
Buildings creaked, windows rattled. The earth seemed to move, almost like it was alive. Some rushed out of their homes, still disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shaking stopped just as suddenly as it had started, leaving a strange silence behind. Was it just a small quake? Or was it a warning of something worse to come? Stick around because what you're about to hear will blow your mind. Something bigger coming. On December 15, 2024, a 5.2 magnitude earthquake hit Northern California. The tremors lasted only a few seconds, but the after effects were much longer. Some people felt the shaking for minutes after the initial jolt. No buildings collapsed, no lives were lost, but the memory of that shaking would stick with many, lingering in the back of their minds.
Scared all of us, and then it all started happening. Everything from the shelves fell down, and the lights started going, and people fell down.
It wasn't the first earthquake in the region, and it likely won't be the last, but something about this one felt different. Could this be a sign of a larger, more dangerous earthquake waiting to strike? Some experts are starting to ask this very question, especially when considering the possibility of a massive event in the future, the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. To understand why the 5.2 tremor got so many people talking, we need to look at the bigger picture. While this earthquake was big enough to make headlines, it was still far smaller than the kind of earthquake that experts worry about most, one that could shake the entire Pacific Northwest, including Northern California. These are the earthquakes that don't just rattle the walls. They have the potential to reshape entire coastlines, triggering tsunamis and causing widespread damage. The recent earthquake could be a warning sign that a bigger quake is building in the Cascadia subduction zone. The Earth around us may be under so much stress that a massive earthquake might be just around the corner. So what is the Cascadia subduction zone? The Cascadia subduction zone is an area where two tectonic plates meet off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Plate, which is moving toward North America, is slowly being forced underneath the North American plate. This process is called subduction, and it's happening right along the coastline of California, Oregon, Washington, and even parts of British Columbia. Over time, this movement causes tension to build up between the plates. The plates are locked in place by friction, and when the pressure becomes too much, it can release suddenly, causing an earthquake. These earthquakes can be extremely powerful and happen without warning. In fact, the largest earthquakes ever recorded in North America have occurred along the Cascadia subduction zone. But what makes this zone so concerning isn't just the earthquakes themselves, it's the other natural disasters they trigger, like tsunamis. When a large earthquake strikes here, it can cause the ocean floor to shift dramatically, sending waves crashing onto the coast. These tsunamis can reach the shore within minutes, giving very little time for people to evacuate. To make things even scarier, experts believe the Cascadia subduction zone is overdue for a major earthquake. The last major earthquake in this region happened on January 26, 1700. Since then, the pressure has been building. Some scientists estimate that this area experiences a large earthquake every 300 to 600 years. With that long gap, it's no wonder that the region's residents are concerned. But here's the tricky part. Earthquakes along the Cascadia subduction zone don't happen regularly. Unlike some other earthquake-prone areas, there's no clear way to predict exactly when the next big one will hit. That makes it even harder for people to prepare. Despite all of this uncertainty, scientists and emergency management teams are doing their best to warn the public about the potential dangers. They've been researching the fault lines, monitoring seismic activity, and creating models to understand how a future earthquake could affect the region. The 5.2 magnitude earthquake. Recently, a 5.2 magnitude earthquake struck Northern California, but it wasn't the largest earthquake ever recorded. But the fact that it happened in an area near the Cascadia subduction zone makes it particularly intriguing. Earthquakes of this size are typically seen as moderate, but they can still cause damage, especially if they occur close to populated areas. So is this earthquake a warning sign of something bigger? Some scientists say it's important to pay attention to these tremors. While a 5.2 earthquake on its own isn't necessarily a precursor to a larger quake, it could be a sign of shifting pressure in the area. In fact, smaller quakes like this are often followed by larger ones, as the energy released by the small quake can trigger more movement along the fault lines. For example, after the 5.2 earthquake, there were several aftershocks recorded in the same region. Aftershocks are common following larger earthquakes, and they can sometimes serve as a warning that more seismic activity is coming. But it's important to note that not every earthquake or aftershock will result in a larger event. The earthquake didn't cause widespread damage. It set off more than 4 dozen aftershocks, with some larger than magnitude 2.5. The shaking was strong enough to rattle parts of Kern County, where large boulders were dislodged along highways. It also stretched as far south as Los Angeles, where weak tremors could be felt. Fortunately, there have been no reports of major damage, but the event serves as a stark reminder of the seismic risks that California faces every year. Scientists closely monitor the activity in hopes of detecting patterns or signs of a bigger quake on the horizon. What makes this even more concerning is the sheer unpredictability of earthquakes. Even with modern technology, scientists can't precisely forecast when an earthquake will hit or how large it will be. Some experts point out that this is precisely why it's crucial to be prepared for an earthquake, regardless of how small or large it may seem. The real cause for concern in Northern California isn't just the recent 5.2 earthquake, but the potential threat that lies beneath the surface. Under the Pacific Ocean, there is the Cascadia subduction zone, a fault notorious for producing massive earthquakes that have the potential to cause widespread devastation. What the earthquake means for Northern California. The 5.2 earthquake that struck Northern California isn't the largest the region has ever seen, but it has certainly captured the attention of many. The quake hit with enough force to shake buildings and rattle windows, leaving residents and experts alike asking questions. Was this earthquake just a minor tremor, or is it a sign of something larger coming? Many people immediately feared that this quake was an early warning, a signal that stress is building along the Cascadia subduction zone, and that a much bigger earthquake could be on the horizon. The size of an earthquake is often measured by its magnitude, and although a 5.2 magnitude earthquake is considered moderate, the fear is that it could indicate increased seismic activity in the region. Earthquakes like these often happen as pressure builds up along fault lines, and when the pressure is released, smaller quakes can follow. But not all earthquakes are precursors to something larger. Scientists have been studying seismic activity for years, and while they can track the movements of tectonic plates and the buildup of stress, predicting the exact timing of a major earthquake is still a challenge. It's important to note that earthquakes are unpredictable events, and one 5.2 quake doesn't necessarily mean that a bigger earthquake is about to strike, but it does show the ongoing risks faced by the region. The question now is whether this earthquake signals a larger pattern of seismic activity in Northern California. Experts are carefully analyzing the data, looking for patterns or signs that the region is entering a period of heightened seismic activity. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches from Northern California up to Vancouver Island in Canada, covering a vast area. When an earthquake occurs here, it's not just a shake that you feel. It can trigger a chain of events, including tsunamis, that can have catastrophic effects on coastal communities. Scientists have long known that the Cascadia subduction zone is capable of producing megathrust earthquakes, which are much larger than the typical quakes we experience. These megathrust earthquakes can reach magnitudes of 9.0 or higher and can last several minutes, shaking buildings, bridges, and roads to their very foundations. When they occur, entire cities can be affected, and the damage can be on an unimaginable scale. There's more. One of the most unsettling facts about the Cascadia subduction zone is that it is locked in some places. meaning the two tectonic plates are stuck together and unable to move. When these plates finally slip, the resulting earthquake can be enormous. The recent 5.2 earthquake in Northern California has raised questions about whether this lock is starting to break, potentially leading to something much larger. Over the past few years, there have been increasing signs that the Cascadia subduction zone may be accumulating significant stress. Studies show that in some areas, the plates are locking together, preventing movement. This locking causes pressure to build over time, similar to the tension in a stretched rubber band. Eventually, that tension can no longer be contained, and when it finally releases, it can lead to a huge earthquake. The way forward. The problem with predicting earthquakes is that it's incredibly difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when the plates will finally slip. Scientists have been studying the Cascadia subduction zone for decades, using seismic data, GPS, and other tools to monitor the movement of the plates. They've found that the plates are not moving smoothly. Instead, they are often locked in place, building up pressure over time. When the pressure becomes too great, the fault will rupture, causing an earthquake. But scientists are still trying to figure out when that will happen. It could be tomorrow, or it could be decades or even centuries before a major earthquake occurs. The uncertainty is part of what makes the situation so unnerving. While it's easy to jump to conclusions, scientists continue to study the patterns of seismic activity. Even though scientists can't predict exactly when a major earthquake will occur along the Cascadia subduction zone, there are steps that everyone living in the region can take to prepare. Earthquakes are unpredictable, and the best way to protect yourself is to be ready for the worst. First, make sure you have an emergency kit with food, water, and supplies that can sustain you for at least 72 hours. In the event of a large earthquake, power outages and road closures are likely, so having enough supplies is essential. Additionally, it's a good idea to have a family emergency plan in place, so everyone knows what to do and where to go if an earthquake strikes. Learn the drop, cover, and hold-on steps. You should also take steps to secure your home. Heavy furniture and appliances should be anchored to the walls, and fragile items should be placed in secure locations. By making these simple adjustments, you can reduce the risk of injury and damage during a quake. Finally, it's important to stay informed about seismic activity in your area. Keep an eye on local news, and make sure you're signed up for earthquake alerts. These alerts can provide valuable information about the timing and intensity of an earthquake, which can help you take action before the shaking starts. The key takeaway: don't wait for the big one to strike. Start preparing now, take action today, and encourage those around you to do the same. Scientists may not be able to stop earthquakes, but you can be ready for them when they come. The recent report. Just early this month, the Yellowstone National Observatory put out its monthly seismic report for November. On the surface, it shows the current volcanic alert level sitting at normal with the aviation color code at green. But the many seismic activities mentioned in the report raises a lot of concerns. To unravel the hidden implications of this report, we have to briefly go back in time to November 2004, a time when major signs of an imminent disaster were on the horizon, but were largely dismissed as normal because of the far bigger warning signs in the past 50 years that didn't lead to anything. Sadly, things went horribly wrong, as on December 26th, a powerful tsunami struck the west coast of northern Sumatra, Indonesia, taking thousands of lives and homes along the way. Now it seems history is about to repeat itself, as the experts at Yellowstone are doing the exact same thing. Many warning signs are on the horizon, but only a few of them see them as a threat. Here is how. As we know, last month was a very busy month for the scientists at Yellowstone. This was mainly because of a very high spike in minor earthquakes, prompting many experts to expect increasing seismic activities in the coming weeks. Throughout the month, Yellowstone experienced a total of 88 earthquakes, with the most devastating occurring on November 7th. Just 2 days before then, there was a hydrothermal explosion at the Black Diamond Pool, one so powerful that it sent large rocks over 20 feet into the air. But not even that compared to what occurred during the final week, particularly from the 26th to the 28th. Simply put, It was a nightmare for the scientists at the observatory, as there was a seemingly endless swarm of over a dozen minor earthquakes that raised a lot of concerns. Because of this, many other experts were called to keep an eye on things while they put out a report on everything they observed in recent weeks, and the details were unbelievable. With almost 90 seismic events recorded and no major steps taken in anticipation, many see the recent report and subsequent reactions as 2004 repeating itself. But besides minor earthquakes at various places, many leading geologists, including famous geophysicist Michael Pollan, believe that an imminent major eruption might be underway if 5 major indications are occurring at similar volcanic regions at the same time. First of all, major ground swells have to be occurring at various places in the area. Secondly, there should be major spikes in temperature at geysers and hot springs scattered around the caldera. Thirdly, there would also be very unusual behavior among animals living in the area, usually involving many species running from their habitat due to the increasing temperatures. Major erratic bursts of steam and other gases should also be observable from various places. And finally, there would be huge cracks appearing at various places across the landscape. To better understand the full extent of these warnings, let's now examine each of these signs and what they mean for the caldera: ground swellings and heat spikes. While most Americans might remember November 5th as a major turning point in modern politics,
now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th President of the United States.
it was a whole different day for the scientists at the park. It was the day Yellowstone experienced its first major sign of eruption for the month, marking a huge moment for the National Observatory. In simple terms, it is what happens when the intense heat from volcanic activity causes the Earth's very hard surface to behave like an elastic balloon. If you feel stuck thinking about it, chances are that it is just as frightening as it sounds. It was captured by the various GPS stations close to the Yellowstone caldera and near Norris Geyser Basin.
This is station P711. It's a GPS station. What we've got is the GPS antenna that's mounted on this very sturdy support here. It's sturdy because we want to look at very, very small changes in ground deformation over time.
A lot of these swellings also happened very slowly, with some beginning from early October. With 2 decades of experience at various observatories, Dr. Michael Pollan explains this, stating how major ground swelling like these hints at an impending eruption. According to Dr. Pollan, underneath Yellowstone is a huge reservoir filled with molten rock under very high pressure. This molten rock, commonly known as magma, is formed when solid rocks are forced to move upwards. As the pressure reduces, the solid rocks melt and become liquid. The same thing happens with tectonic plates, where ice chunks that exist at the bottom of the sea turn liquid as they come up to the surface. So with the molten rock being lighter than the solid rocks around it, it naturally floats upwards, accompanied by the intense pressure that forces it in that direction. This usually happens when the magma finds a path through which it can reach the surface. But when there is no path, the molten rock forces its way upwards, causing major ground swellings at various places surrounding the mighty caldera. And that is exactly what was observed on November 5th. With one box ticked, this leads us to the next big sign of an imminent eruption, and that is major spikes in temperature and various places. We can easily tick this box with the various temperature spikes occurring currently at the Norris Geyser Basin, Mammoth Hot Springs, and Midway Geyser Basin. These happened throughout the month, with the most shocking spike occurring on November 5th and 26th. Dr. Mark Stelton, deputy scientist in charge of the observatory, reported that these springs suddenly went a lot hotter than usual. For context, before the sudden increase, most of the springs averaged at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But on November 5th, temperatures increased by over 100 degrees in a matter of hours, settling at just over 345. This was way too sudden to be taken lightly, and he explained that it was caused by the quick heating of the water around these areas of rising molten rock. This sudden surge in temperatures implies that the magma is rising much quicker than normal, and while this alone isn't enough to prove a major eruption is slated to happen anytime soon, it stands as a warning when associated with the other factors. Dr. Robert Smith, another geophysicist from the University of Utah, wrote about this in great length. His studies show that while this alone isn't enough proof, it usually came before the major eruptions that have occurred in recent history. This presents a problem with the current scientific standard, as past major eruptions show that not all 5 indicators have to be present for an eruption to occur. According to Dr. Smith, the best way to arrive at a good conclusion is by learning from history, not just relying on modern monitoring techniques that aren't completely reliable. The air is still a lot more to reveal: hydrothermal explosions and unusual animal behavior. Other events that made history and raised a lot of eyebrows at the observatories include the strange behaviors of certain animals at Yellowstone, most particularly among the bison, elks, and wolves. As we know, Yellowstone, like most other mountainous regions outside the tropics, can be very brutal on animals during winter, a time when those places become very cold and food becomes difficult to find. Due to the higher presence of food, bisons are known for living in these elevated regions, but from November 5th, experts and the Yellowstone Observatory noticed that these animals were now moving to lower places in the region, despite not having as much food as they would in the higher places. Due to the harsh winter, these bisons found warmth in the lower places where the hot springs and geysers were suddenly heating up. In contrast, elks moved to the much colder regions of the park. They preferred to stay in places that weren't affected by the volcanic activities. The wolves, on the other hand, mostly took the same routes as the bisons, often preferring to stay in the much warmer regions, as it helped them become more active with hunting and other activities. They were found in many places they normally wouldn't be, including places near the Midway Geyser Basin. For better understanding, this was explained by Professor Mark Boyce, a renowned ecologist who worked at the observatory. He pointed out that animals are very sensitive to environmental changes, sometimes much better than humans. In this case, they noticed the sudden shift in temperatures occurring in the area and adapted accordingly. This, according to Dr. Boyce, most likely points to a sudden surge in volcanic activities in the area, as he noticed this among the new gray wolves introduced to the park barely a year ago. This leads us to our next big indicator: the unexpected bursts of steam and other gases from various places. And as usual, Yellowstone ticks this box very easily, especially considering the multiple dangerous hydrothermal explosions that occurred on the 5th and 26th of November. These explosions are caused by the forceful breaking forth of underground steam, powerful enough to send full-grown adults hundreds of meters into the air. Thankfully, no tourists were close enough to experience this, as Yellowstone officials have learned from previous experiences not to let visitors anywhere near these places, but the nearby boardwalk and benches were destroyed. Many clues link this to a potential eruption, including major insights given by Dr. Michael Stelton, a renowned geologist working with the United States Geological Survey. Dr. Stelton gives 2 possible causes for these explosions. He argues that either the natural plumbing system is clogged or the water is heated by the molten rock. For the first instance, he explained that places like Yellowstone have natural channels where water flows underneath the ground. When the water gets blocked by expanding rocks along the way, it heats up and turns into steam, and the intense pressure from this quick transformation causes the explosion. For the second explanation, Dr. Stelton agrees with most other experts at the observatory by pointing to the molten rock under the surface as the main cause. When the molten rock heats the underground water, it quickly becomes the steam that quickly builds up pressure before breaking forth from the Earth's surface. As we've seen, thanks to the input from trusted scholars and experts, Yellowstone ticks yet another box. Now, we are one step closer to a full-scale warning from nature about an imminent threat. Stay tuned as we look at the final indicator for this imminent catastrophe: visible cracks and devastating implications. Earlier on, we talked about ground swellings caused by molten rock that make the Earth's surface behave like an elastic skin, but that when the Earth's surface reaches its elastic limit, it cracks. And these cracks have always been rampant at various points around Norris Geyser Basin, Mammoth Hot Springs, and Midway Geyser Basin. As always, these cracks began to form on November 5th and became most obvious to onlookers by the 26th. Dr. Michael Poland and the other scientists investigated these places and collected samples. They took measurements and wrote down their reports, and after over a week of intense study, many of the readings and conclusions alone implied there was nothing to be worried about. But when accompanied by the other factors, Dr. Poland understood the need to make things clear. Much of what he explained aligned with what we've discussed, linking the cracks with rising molten rock and intense pressure.
Well, it's almost been a week since a hydrothermal explosion at Yellowstone National Park. NBC Montana's Brianna Henderson spoke with an expert from the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory to unearth more about the natural phenomenon.
As you've seen, Yellowstone meets all the requirements to be considered a potential threat. This causes many to wonder why there have been no strict measures taken in anticipation of this catastrophe, and the reason so far is that recent history shows far greater signs that didn't amount to anything. Because of this, those at the Yellowstone Observatory decide not to call for an emergency until all indicators reach a highly critical level, one that hasn't been observed in over half a century. Until this happens, all simultaneous seismic activities are seen as normal, and as far as the experts are concerned, there is nothing to worry about. But if past events have taught us anything, it's to be prepared at all times in situations like this. So what do you think? Is there truly nothing to be worried about? Is there any point in getting prepared?
After the extremely devastating 1906 San Francisco quake, he was tasked with investigating its source. To do this, he surveyed the surface ruptures, including offsets such as fences or roads sliced in half, and plotted their locations on a map. He noticed that these offsets aligned perfectly with the fault he had previously identified, leading him to conclude that the fault was responsible for the earthquake. Interestingly, this discovery also led to identifying a new type of earthquake known as an intermediate depth earthquake. Although the visibility of the San Andreas fault can sometimes be problematic, much of the San Andreas fault's length is visible as a straight depression. This has produced a characteristic pattern of lakes, bays, and valleys. These qualities may not be immediately apparent from the ground. For instance, drivers may need to be informed that they are in the San Andreas earthquake zone as they pass close to Crystal Springs Reservoir near San Francisco, Tomales Bay, or through Cajun or Tejan passes. The location of the fault on the Earth's surface can be determined by carefully examining the landscape in the area. Moreover, in some places, like the Carrizo Plain in San Luis Obispo County and the Olimatrof in Marin County, the San Andreas Fault is clearly visible as a succession of scarps and pressure ridges. Wickedly destructive and potentially still so, this fault is the most dangerous in America. With the number of lives it has claimed and could still claim, there is possibly nothing like it in the world currently. Fast back to over 600 years, it released earthquakes like a mother dishing out candies to have a poor little baby. Somehow, that has since stopped for a while. In fact, current data shows that since 1857, Southern California, the hub of the fault, has never recorded any earthquake. To know how heavy the earthquake around this place can be, we are sorry to announce that the one of 1857 had a magnitude of 7.9 and resulted in damage along a stretch of about 185 miles, taking the total lives possible in that area at that time, and destroying some other things. Unfortunately, the recent drought of quakes has led many scientists to think the probability of an imminent quake is ever higher than necessary. In fact, according to some, the coming one will be a big one because of the drought. Thus, given the strains and pressure it has collected over the years, the fault remains a time-ticking bomb that may devastate things. The Pacific and American tectonic plates meet near the San Andreas Fault's border. These two plates remain in constant contact, creating pressure that finally manifests as earthquakes and causes catastrophic loss of life and property. Elastic rebound is the name of the entire process. These cause seismic waves, which move through the earth and shake the surface as they collide and crash into one another. That is why the San Andreas Fault in Northern California can experience an earthquake, but not the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. Is California going to be swallowed up anytime soon? First, you'll perhaps like to hear this. the already identified upcoming large-scale earthquake, or the big one, as it is generally known, won't be this deadly California swallowing core that we are being told will happen. In light of current research in the field, except for the economic drawback it will cause, this earthquake will be far from its predecessor, the one of 1857. There are very good reasons for this. Since we do not mind keeping you in the dark, let us observe them closely. First, structures. In quakes, the death caused by structures falling apart is more than those caused by the shocks and tremors of the quake themselves, except in the case of house-swallowing ones. The Southern California administration, noticing this many years back, has embarked on a nationwide principle-backed construction of houses and other structures that will make them unable to be destroyed by quakes. This does not mean structures can be totally earthquake-proof. It just means, given the fact that the earthquake might not be that strong, and the fact that structures in California are constructed in accordance with some of the most stringent seismic resistance regulations in the world, the earthquake having an ultra-destructive impact, as is often portrayed, is unlikely. Meanwhile, state infrastructure, such as electric power, communication masts, and more, is expected to be extremely damaged by the quake since they cannot withstand it. This will stop communication flow abruptly until something is done to it. Corroborating this is people undergoing significant research. Of course, this does not mean everything is in place. Let's turn to what some scientists do to predict what could happen. First, in a bid to understand the future scenario of the quake, they adopted the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake as a model, and the result is the same as what has been said earlier, albeit with some differences that will be mentioned later. The IT industry will experience communication problems for a very long time.
Could this recent earthquake be nature's way of giving us a subtle warning? Are we listening closely enough, or are we underestimating what the Cascadia fault might have in store? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen, and you will enjoy it.